Let's bring in Jamil Jaffer. He's the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute. He's also the former associate White House counsel to President George W. Bush. Good to have you with us. So let's start with those unconfirmed reports of a chemical attack by Russia in the war-torn city of Mariupol. The British and Australian governments are investigating. So if it turns out that Russia did use chemical agents in an attack, does that change the calculus for how America responds? Should it change the calculus?
Well, Joe, it's a great question. As Molly pointed out, the UK has indicated that all options are on the table. President Biden last week said that he would calibrate. There would be a NATO response, but he'd calibrate that response depending on what type of chemical weapons were used and what the use was. Look, I think there's no question that NATO has to respond to the use of chemical weapons in the heart of Europe, if in fact that's what happened here. It is hard to imagine a world in which chemical weapons are allowed to be used and there is not a significant response from NATO. And frankly, Joe, I think that response has got to be military.
Yeah. So what exactly does that mean if it's military?
I mean, look, it's got to be some sort of a offensive response to Russian forces that were involved in the use of chemical weapons, if in fact that's what happened here. We don't know, in fact, if chemical weapons were used, but if they were, you've got to take out those elements or respond to those in order to deter future use. Vladimir Putin responds to power. We haven't demonstrated the willingness to use a lot of power against Putin directly. He will continue to engage in these activities if we don't respond in that way, Joe.
Now, Russia appears to be moving troops and military equipment to eastern Ukraine to prepare for that new offensive in the Donbass region. Do you think Ukraine is ready and properly equipped to combat this new attack? Can they mount the same counteroffensive in the east that we saw near Kyiv?
Well, certainly Ukraine has the motivation and increasingly with the supplies coming in from NATO has the weaponry to respond effectively. The one challenge that they face, of course, is that the Russians can simply seek to outlast them and starve out their population and sort of bring the war directly to civilians as they have repeatedly over and over. We've seen the war crimes that Russian soldiers have committed against the people of Ukraine. It's going to be, at least for a while, something of a stalemate because the Russian forces that are coming back to the east from Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine are largely demoralized. The new forces they're trying to bring in will take some time to come online. That means that this fight will go on for a long period. And the Russians, without a response from the West that's more than simply providing weapons, have little incentive to negotiate other than to continue to do what they're doing, which is attack the civilian population. And that's going to be hugely destructive to the people of Ukraine.
We know Russia has pulled out of Kyiv for now. We've heard this talk this week of maybe Russia trying to go back to Kyiv if it has more victories in the east. Does that seem like a realistic possibility to you, or would it be even harder this time around for Russia to try and succeed in taking Kyiv?
Well, look, at least for now, Russia is going to focus on the east as well as the south and try to grab that port city of Odessa. If they're successful there, there's no doubt in my mind that over time, Vladimir Putin will want to try and achieve more control over Ukraine. We saw this before with the 2013-2014 invasion of Crimea, and now we're seeing it here in the eastern parts of Ukraine. We saw him push to Kyiv unsuccessfully, but in order to regain his credibility at home, he's going to need to hold control over those eastern parts and Odessa, and then potentially make a move down the road. That could be weeks, months, years from now. But again, Putin responds to power. And the West to date has demonstrated that we're not willing to intervene aggressively enough to deter him. And so the question becomes, when will he do it, not whether.
Jamil, let's talk about refugees. Poland alone has taken in more than 2.5 million Ukrainians in such a short period of time. We know countless families have welcomed refugees with open arms into their homes, but this is also placing a huge strain on the country. I mean, is it just too much to handle?
Well, Poland has dealt with refugees for a long time, refugees coming out of the Syrian conflict and the like. And there have been political repercussions in Poland as a result of the refugee flows, as there has been across Europe. We've got about 10 million displaced persons coming out of the Ukraine conflict, 6.5 million internally displaced, 4 roughly displaced outside of Ukraine, a huge chunk in Poland. That can have a destabilizing effect on the country. And while the Polish people are being very generous with their money and their time, as is their government, the question becomes how long and how is the international community going to respond and provide support to nations like Poland that are straining under the refugee flows coming out of Ukraine?
What's the most helpful thing right now? What is the best solution to try and ease the issues that Poland's dealing with?
Well, a lot of it can come from supplies and assistance to Poland directly. They're spending a lot of money and their own supplies to do this effort, undertake this, which is noble of them. but they can be backfilled by other states in Europe as well as the United States. That's going to have to be part of what the international community. And by the way, it's not just the Western coalition. The larger UN should get involved here and provide significant humanitarian assistance as they're beginning to do. They need to ramp that up very quickly.
All right, Jamil Jaffer, thanks so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate your analysis.